The Olympic Mountains are a mountain range on the Olympic Peninsula of western Washington in the United States. The mountains, part of the Pacific Coast Ranges, are not especially high. Mount Olympus is the highest at 7,962 feet. However, the eastern slopes rise out of Puget Sound and the western slopes are separated from the Pacific Ocean by the 20 to 35 kilometers wide Pacific Ocean coastal plain. The western slopes are the wettest place in the 48 contiguous states. Most of the mountains are protected within the bounds of the Olympic National Park. The mountains are spread out across 4 counties: Clallam, Grays Harbor, Jefferson, and Mason. Physiographically, they are a section of the larger Pacific Border Province, which is in turn a part of the larger Pacific Mountain System. Geography. The Olympics have the form of a cluster of steep-sided peaks surrounded by heavily forested foothills and incised by deep valleys. They are surrounded by water on 3 sides, separated from the Pacific by the 20 to 35 kilometers wide coastal plain. The general form of the range is more or less circular, or somewhat horseshoe-shaped, and the drainage pattern is radial. Rivers radiate outwards to all sides, clockwise from windward to leeward. The major watersheds are Winoochee, Humphchilips, Quinault, Queets, Ho, Bogachiel, La, Elwha, Dungeness, Quilcene, Doswarlips, Duckbush, Hammer, and Skaukomish. List of summits. Principal summits: Mount Olympus, highest point, 8 glaciers. Mount Constance, largest peak visible from Seattle. Mount Anderson, west peak of Mount Anderson, is the hydrographic apex of the Olympic Mountains. For this peak, rivers flow outward to the Pacific Ocean, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Hood Canal. The Brothers, double peak visible from Seattle. Mount Deception, Mount Angeles. Other summits: Boulder Peak located in the Lake Crescent and Elwha River area. Mount Storm King, located just to the south of Lake Crescent. Hurricane Ridge, road accessible summit near Port Angeles. Protected areas. A large portion of the range is contained within the Olympic National Park. Of this, 95% is part of the Olympic Wilderness. The national park is surrounded on the south, east, and northwest sides by the Olympic National Forest, with 5 wilderness areas, and on the southwest side by the Clearwater State Forest with 1 natural area preserve, and the Quinault Indian Reservation. State parks and wildlife areas occur in the lower elevations. Climate. Precipitation varies greatly throughout the range, from the wet western slopes to the arid eastern ridges. Mount Olympus, nearly 8,000 feet tall, is a mere 35 miles from the Pacific Ocean, one of the steepest reliefs globally and accounting for the high precipitation of the area. As much as 240 inches of snow and rain on Mount Olympus. 140 to 170 inches of rain falls on the Hoh rainforest annually, receiving the most precipitation of anywhere in the continental United States. Areas to the northeast of the mountains are located in a rain shadow and receive as little as 16 in of precipitation. Annual precipitation increases to about 30 in on the edges of the rain shadow around Port Townsend, the San Juan Islands, and Everett. 80% of precipitation falls during the winter. On the coastal plain, the winter temperature stays between -2 to 7 degrees Celsius. During the summer it warms up to stay between 10 and 24 degrees Celsius. As a consequence of the high precipitation is the large number of snowfields and glaciers reaching down to 1,500 meters above sea level. There are about 266 glaciers crowning the Olympic's peaks. The most prominent glaciers are those on Mount Olympus, covering approximately 10 square miles. Beyond the Olympic complex are the glaciers of Mount Carey, the Bailey Range, Mount Christie, and Mount Anderson. Geology. The Olympics are made up of obducted clastic wedge material and oceanic crust. They are primarily Eocene sandstones, turbidites, and basaltic oceanic crust. Unlike the Cascades, the Olympic Mountains are not volcanic, and contain no granite. Millions of years ago, vents and fissures opened under the Pacific Ocean and lava flowed forth, creating huge underwater mountains and ranges called seamounts. The Farallon tectonic plate that formed a part of the Pacific Ocean floor inched eastward toward North America about 35 million years ago, and most of the seafloor subducted beneath the continental landmass of the North America plate. Some of the seafloor, however, was scraped off and jammed against the mainland, creating the dome that was the forerunner of today's Olympics. In this particular case, the future Olympics were being jammed into a corner created by the Vancouver Island and North Cascades microcontinents attached to the western edge of the North America plate. This is thought to be the origin of the curved shape of the Olympic basaltic horseshoe, an arc of basalt running east along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, south along Hood Canal, and then west to Lake Quinault. Thrust faulting northeast into the Vancouver Island, North Cascades corner pushes Olympic rock upward and southwestward, resulting in strata that appear to be standing on edge and that intermix with strata of different mineral composition. All this occurred underwater. The Olympics began to rise above the sea only 10–20 million years ago. The Olympics were shaped in the Pleistocene era by both alpine and continental glaciers advancing and retreating multiple times. The valleys of the Hoh, Queets, and Quinault rivers are typical U-shaped valleys carved by advancing alpine glaciers. Piles of talus and rockfall were created by retreating alpine glaciers. In the high mountains, the major rivers have the headwaters in alpine glacially carved cirques. During the Orting, followed by the Stuck, the Salmon Springs, and the Fraser glaciations, the vast continental Cordilleran ice sheet descended from Alaska south through British Columbia to the Olympics. The ice split into the Juan de Fuca and Puget ice lobes as they encountered the resistant Olympic mountains, carving out the current waterways and advanced as far south as present-day Olympia. Ice flowed up the river valleys as far as 3,800 feet, carrying granitic glacial erratics with it. Ecology. The mountains support a variety of different ecosystems, varying by elevation and relative east-west location, which influences the local climate, primarily precipitation. Flora. Olympic forests are coniferous forests, unique among temperate forests in their almost complete dominance by conifers rather than by hardwoods. The hardwood-conifer timber volume ratio is 1 to 1,000 in the maritime Pacific Northwest. Another unique feature of Olympic forests is the size and longevity of the dominant tree species. Every coniferous genus represented here is represented by its largest and longest-lived species, and some of its second and third-ranked species as well. Biomass accumulations are among the highest in the temperate forest zones. Dominance of conifers is thought to be a result of the amount and timing of precipitation. The dry summers limit the growth of deciduous trees, such as most hardwoods. Evergreens, such as most conifers, are able to take advantage of the winter precipitation by continuing to photosynthesize through fall, winter and early spring, when deciduous trees are not able to photosynthesize. No deciduous conifers occur in the Olympics. Large trees occur in the much drier eastern Cascades, but not in the Olympics or western Cascades. There is only one species of evergreen hardwood, the madrone. The great size and age of conifers here is thought to be a result of the relative lack of frequent windstorms like tropical cyclones. Along the western flanks of the mountains, the increased orographic precipitation supports temperate rainforests in the Quinault, Queets, Hoh, and Bogachiel river valleys at low elevations. Protection by Olympic National Park has allowed these rainforests to retain old-growth trees, which supports a varied ecosystem. The Olympic rainforests are composed primarily of Sitka spruce and western hemlock, as of the surrounding lowland Sitka spruce forests, but are distinct in having a relative abundance of groves of bigleaf maple and vine maple, which support large epiphytic communities of mosses, lichens, ferns, and club mosses, an abundance of nurse logs on the forest floor, a relatively open forest canopy and sparse shrub layer, and a dense moss layer on the forest floor. The rainforests of the wintering grounds for herds of Roosevelt elk, and it is thought that browsing by the elk is responsible for the open shrub layer and the dominance of Sitka spruce over western hemlock. The rainforests are just one type of forest found in the Olympic Mountains. Franklin and Dearness set out 5 forest zones: Sitka spruce, western hemlock, silver fir, mountain hemlock, and subalpine parkland. Other authors include a 6th, Douglas fir zone. Different plant associations are typical of one or more forest zones. For instance, the rainforest plant association described above is a member of the Sitka spruce forest zone. The Sitka spruce zone is a lowland zone dominated by Sitka spruce and western hemlock. Precipitation is high, winters are mild, elevations are low. This forest zone is typically found at very low elevations on the western coastal plain and not in mountainous areas, although it can be found as high as 1,900 feet. The lower elevations of the Olympic Mountains, from roughly 480 feet up to 1,800 feet 3,700 feet, feature the western hemlock zone, so called because in most of the zone, the climax tree species would be western hemlock, even though much of the area is dominated by Douglas fir. The reason for this is that Douglas fir is an early seral species, and reproduces primarily after disturbances such as fire, logging, landslides, and wind storms. Western hemlock does not reproduce well on disturbed, exposed soil but germinates under the canopy of Douglas fir, eventually overtaking the forest by shading out the Douglas fir, which cannot reproduce in shade. In this zone, despite the high annual precipitation, drought stress in summer is sufficiently severe to limit growth of many species, such as Sitka spruce. Hardwoods such as bigleaf maple, willows, and red alder are limited to disturbed sites and riparian areas. Red cedar grows in the wettest sites. A very small area of the northeastern rain shadow contains the limited Douglas fir zone, where it is too dry for western hemlock. Moving up in elevation and moisture availability is the silver fir zone, up to about 3,900 feet. This zone gets more precipitation, and more of it as snow, than the lower, warmer, drier western hemlock zone. The cold and the snowpack combine to limit growth of lower elevation plants. On the other hand, silver fir is less drought-tolerant and less fire-tolerant than either Douglas fir or western hemlock. Slide alder grows in snow creep areas and avalanche chutes, along with yellow cedar. Meadows of thimbleberry also grow in this zone, often integrating between the slide alder shoots and the silver fir forest. The next higher forest zone is the mountain hemlock zone, the highest forest zone in the Olympic Mountains. In this zone most precipitation falls as snow and the snow-free growing season is very short. In the drier rain shadow side of the mountains, mountain hemlock is largely replaced by subalpine fir. At the higher elevations of the mountain hemlock, subalpine fir zone, tree cover is reduced to isolated stands of trees called tree islands, surrounded by subalpine meadows. In the subalpine parkland zone, variations in substrate, topography, moisture, and snowpack depth and duration determine the vegetation community. tree islands form on convex topography, which tends to gather less snow and shed it sooner than surrounding level or concave topography. In the west, the subalpine zone is dominated by mountain hemlock. It occurs along with subalpine fir from 1,100 to 1,650 meters in the Bailey Range. However, the range of this forest type is not extensive and does not extend much west of Mount Olympus, nor is it common in the east. Comici parisnutcatensis yellow cedar is sometimes found in relation to these plants. In the east and other drier areas, the subalpine zone is dominated by subalpine fir. It can occur with other trees, including mountain hemlock, silver fir, and yellow cedar. But what characterizes these zones is the dominance of subalpine fir. These forests occur on the eastern ridges from 1,300 to 1,800 meters. In the Olympics, the tree line is between 5,000 feet and 6,000 feet, but can be as low as under 4,000 feet in some places. Tree line is a function of both elevation and precipitation, particularly the amount of snow that falls each winter. The growing season for trees is relatively short in the higher elevations of the Windward Olympics, compared to similar elevations in other mountain ranges, due to the large accumulations of snow that take a long time to melt each year. Subalpine meadows in the Olympic Mountains are of 5 types. Heath shrub meadows are dominated by ericaceous huckleberries and heathers. Lush herbaceous meadows are typified by Sitka-valerian and showy sedge. Drier areas are those with longer snow-cover grow dwarf sedge or grass meadows. Phlox diffusa typifies the low herbaceous meadows of pumice, talus and scree slopes and other rocky areas. American saw-wort is common in both mountain meadows and lower subalpine parklands in the Olympics. Above timberline is the alpine zone, not a forest zone since no trees can grow this high. The alpine zone in the Olympics is much more limited in size than in other temperate mountain ranges, from 1,800 meters to 2,250 meters. The high precipitation of the Olympics creates permanent snow and ice at lower elevations than is typical for other mountain ranges, cutting off the alpine vegetation zone. Most of the alpine vegetation is on the range shadow side, in the northeastern Olympics, where there is less permanent snow and ice. Alpine vegetation is low herbaceous, typified by Phlox diffusa and species of carex. Many of the Olympic Mountains' endemic plants occur here, such as Piper's bellflower and Olympic violet. Endemic plants: Olympic mountain milkvetch astragalus australis var. Olympicus, Piper's bellflower Campanula paperi, spotted coral roots Corallariza maculata var. Ozatensis, Flet's fleabane Erigeron fletii, Thompson's wandering fleabane Erigeron peregrinus ssp. Peregrinus var. Thompsoni, Quinolphorn Lilierithonium quinortensis, Olympic rockmap Petrophyllum hendersoni, Olympic mountain groundsel Senecio neo-websteri, Olympic cutleaf Cyntharis pinnatifida var. Lanuginoso, Olympic mountain dandelion Taraxacum olympicum, Olympic violet Viola fletii. Fauna: mammals extirpated from the Olympic Mountains of the fisher and the gray wolf. The fisher was declared extirpated from Washington state when no fishes were detected during statewide carnivore surveys in the 1990s and 2000s. A reintroduction project was initiated in 2007 in partnership with Olympic National Park. The gray wolf was extirpated from Washington state in the early 20th century. The last wolf documented in the Olympics was trapped in 1920. In the early 21st century, wolves are naturally migrating back into eastern and north-central Washington state, but there is no evidence of wolf migration into the Olympics and no plan to translocate wolves to the Olympics. The gray wolf is listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the fisher is listed as state endangered by the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission. Previous to the extirpation of the gray wolf, coyotes occurred in the lowlands of the Olympic Peninsula but not in the mountains. With the absence of wolves, coyotes have been moving up into the higher elevations of the mountains and may be responsible for population declines in the Olympic marmot. The mountain goat is not native to the Olympic Mountains but was introduced for hunting in the 1920s by a coalition of the Forest Service, the Clallam County Game Warden, and the State Game Commission. Mountain goats in the Olympics have been associated with damage to alpine vegetation and soil erosion, and have shown aggression towards people. In 1999, a mountain goat gored a hiker at the summit of Mount Helena in Olympic National Forest, and in 2010, a mountain goat fatally gored a hiker on the Klahani Ridge Trail in Olympic National Park. In 2012, the trail to Mount Helena was closed in summer due to aggressive goats, reopening in the fall. Roosevelt Elk Service Canadensis Roosevelti range along the Pacific coast from the Russian River to Vancouver Island. Olympic and Vancouver Island elk are some of the last pure Roosevelt elk herds left. Those in the Cascades have mixed with Rocky Mountain elk. Olympic National Park has the largest population of Roosevelt elk in the world. Some herds spend winter in lowland valleys, summer in high country in subalpine meadows. Other herds live year-round in lowland forests and meadows. Elk prefer more humid areas, the Sitka spruce, wet western hemlock, and mountain hemlock zones. Elk browsing is believed to be responsible for the open park-like structure of the Olympic rainforests. The elk graze on hemlock and shrubs, leaving the Sitka spruce to grow. Elk browsing also increases diversity of grasses and forbs. Elk exclosure experiments in rainforest valleys show more species of vegetation growing outside the exclosures, where elk browse, than inside. While there are more brush and saplings inside exclosures, there are more grasses and forbs outside. Elk browsing improves forage for other herbivores like deer, voles, and snowshoe hares. Elk prefer old-growth forest and young alder groves over the large, even-aged plantations common on commercial timberland. Although they will use small, recent clear-cuts where they mimic natural forest openings. Both the Press and O'Neill expeditions were impressed by the quantity and tameness of the elk. Both expedition leaders prohibited shooting the elk and deer except when the expedition was in need of meat. The Olympic National Monument was formed to protect the elk after the herds were reduced to less than 2,000 animals. The population rebounded, and in 1937 a hunting season for elk was opened in the Hoh River Valley. 2,000 to 4,000 hunters came, several times as many as expected. One hunter was accidentally shot and died. A second hunter drowned in the Hoh River. A pack horse was shot. The Hoh River flooded, stranding hunters and washing away the camps. Forest Service and state game personnel were overwhelmed with rescue efforts and dispute resolution. Over 800 elk were killed, some left lying in the forest. Proponents of a national park used the 1937 elk hunt as an argument in favor of permanent protection for Olympics elk herds. Not all the elk herds are protected inside the national park. Some migrate in and out of the park, and others live entirely outside the park. These are subject to regulated hunting when not in the national park. Black-tailed deer prefer drier areas than elk, such as the dry western hemlock, Douglas fir, and subalpine fir zones. Similar to the elk, black-tailed deer winter in lowlands, or along south-facing ridges, and summer in the high country meadows. American black bear are numerous in the Olympics. Olympic bears eat salmon, rodents, huckleberries, tree bark, insects, and deer or elk carcasses. Cougar is the largest carnivore in the Olympics. The main prey are deer and elk, but they also hunt porcupines and insects. They are rarely seen in the Olympics but are thought to be widespread and relatively common. Mountain beaver is a large primitive rodent endemic to the Pacific Northwest. They are common in the Olympics, preferring wet scrubby thickets and second-growth timber. Banana slug is another Pacific Northwest endemic. Slugs are abundant in the Olympic forests, outweighing mammals and birds combined. They thrive in the cool, damp shade of the forests. The banana slug is the largest and most conspicuous of Olympic slugs. Northern spotted owl is an old-growth dependent species and is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The majority of spotted owls on the Olympic Peninsula, along with the largest preserve of temperate old-growth forest, live in the national park. Spotted owls prey on flying squirrels and snowshoe hares, and are themselves preyed on by great horned owls, Bubo virginianus. The density of the canopy of an old-growth forest gives the spotted owl some protection from the larger, less agile great horned owls. Rufous hummingbird is the only hummingbird in the Olympics. They overwinter in Mexico and Southern California, arriving in the Olympics in February and March with the flowering of the Indian plum Oemlaria ceracifera. Harlequin duck breeds in fast-moving mountain streams in the Olympics. They spend the rest of the year in coastal waters. Osprey and bald eagle fish in Olympic rivers, nesting in large old trees. Both are relatively common, the bald eagle more so along the coast than in the mountains. Olympic rivers are dominated by Pacific salmonids, the Oncorhynchus, Chinook, coho, pink, rainbow and steelhead, and cutthroat all spawn in Olympic rivers. Chum and sockeye also live in coastal Olympic Peninsula rivers but do not reach into the mountains. Bull trout and Dolly Varden trout also live in Olympic rivers. Endemic fauna. There are at least 16 endemic animal species. Mammals: Olympic marmot, Olympic chipmunk, Olympic snow mole, Mizama pocket gopher, Olympic ermine. Amphibians: Olympic torrent salamander, fish: Olympic mud minnow, Beardsley rainbow trout, Crescenti cutthroat trout. Insects: halberd skipper butterfly, Olympic grasshopper, Man's gazelle beetle, Quiute gazelle beetle, tiger beetle. Mollusks: Arionid slug, Arionid jumping slug. Near endemics, those that occur in the Olympics as well as other parts of a limited range, include the Cope's giant salamander, and the Van Dyke's salamander, both found primarily in the Olympics and other mountainous areas of western Washington, the tailed frog, of Pacific Northwest mountain streams, and the mountain beaver of the coastal Pacific Northwest.